Okay, this is a tape or a few tapes that cover a little bit that I can remember of my life as a soldier between 1942 and 45.
I left the University of New Hampshire at the end of my first semester at Christmas break to join the American Field Service, which was serving the British driving ambulances in the Western Desert. And because I was too young for the Army, I was only 17. And the problem that fell apart, the idea fell apart because I didn't have the funds to go there. You had to pay your own way. I didn't have means of getting their uniforms. So I temporarily went to art school in Boston until my 18th birthday. In fact, I was at Gloucester, setting up to assist the artist, Mr. Ernest Thurn, for summer school. And upon my 18th birthday, I decided that I belonged to doing something for the war. So I left there, and my first idea was to join the Merchant Marine Officers Training School, and that fizzled because my eyes weren't good enough. And then I tried the Air Force, parachutist, and glider, and those also failed. So my last choice was the U.S. Cavalry. So I went down to the recruiting office, and I enlisted in the cavalry. In fact, I actually went to the old armory. It was built before the first armory. It's now part, I believe, of the center of New Hampshire. And there enlisted. First, I had to have my parents, because even though I was 18 years old, my parents' permission was required. So I had to go first to my mother, and then to my father, and then to my mother to persuade them both to sign. And when we went down, there were long lines of people that were being drafted. They were being inducted, first being given their physical, and after their physicals, I believe they had 30 or 90 days to report for their induction. But the few of us who were enlisting, there were 3 or 4, were treated royally. We were enlisted as regulars, which in the Army meant something in those days. And they quickly gave us our physical and our exam, and I was sworn into the Army. After I was sworn in, they said, "We're sorry, but the horse cavalry is being done away with. But the newest things, armor, tanks are very much like horses, and why don't you join the armored force?" And I finally said, okay, and that's how I went into the armored force. And so I said, can I go home and get a few things? When am I leaving, How long have I got? And they said, oh, you're leaving this afternoon for Camp Devens, and from there you'll go to Fort Knox for training, the Armored Force Replacement Training Center. And I said, well, can I go home and get a toothbrush and get some money and stuff? And they said, no, Sergeant here will take you to lunch at Roy's Diner. And I believe that was on Elm Street at the time, that particular one. There were several. And I called my folks so they could bring me down a wallet and bring me down a toothbrush. And that afternoon I was on a bus for Camp Devens. And the next day we left by train for Fort Knox. And just to back up and fill in a couple of things here. My date of enlistment was the 9th of July, 1942. And my date of entry into active service was 9th of July, 1942. And the component of the Army was the armored force of the Army of the United States. This has made a difference because, my serial number was 110-401-67. And 110-401-67 would indicate to the regular Army people that I wasn't a draftee, that I was an enlistee, which was important then in the area that you came from, and so forth. Went through basic training at Fort Knox. Shortly after arriving, maybe 2 weeks, I was made an acting corporal, a lance corporal. In those days, it was a black armband with a corporal's insignia on the armband. And the company commander told me that myself and a few others were going to be put in for Officers Candidate School, and therefore we needed trained men. So I went through basic fairly rapidly that way, doing everything everybody else did, but also having to lead them, leading calisthenics, doing 100 and some odd push-ups, and to show that you can do them, and so forth. We went to routine Armored Force Replacement Center training, learned all the different weapons. exam for Officers of Canada School. My company commander was on the board, so he told me afterwards that it would pass flying colors. It was just a case of now the routine security check, and we'd be in. Well, the routine security check, in my case, was taking some time because I had been very politically radical in school. And so in the meantime, the company finished basic, and the other fellows went off to various assignments, and where mine was, I was being held up because I was going to go to Officers of Canada School, and the company commander felt I needed experience drilling, and I was acting cadre for a short time until this thing was cleared up. So I taught 30 caliber machine gun to officers who were reserve officers who were coming back into the service and didn't have any real training on small arms. So, and that was my specialty, was the 30 caliber machine gun. My military classification throughout the war was light machine gunner. 604 is the specialty number. So anyway, when it bounced, the security check bounced, and I was assigned instead as a replacement to the 80th Armored Regiment, which was located on Fort Knox. Now, the 80th Armored Regiment seemed to be a bunch of people that were together for a long time, and I don't know whether they were National Guards, they were called up, or reserves, or whatever, but they all knew each other. They came and went on leaves. And the outfit was doing basically, simple training, close order drill and weapons training and different things that I had just finished doing. So I didn't like that. I wanted to get out and do something different. So I started applying for transfer. Well, applying for transfer is never a popular thing in the Army. So I would report to the first sergeant, ask for a transfer, nothing would happen. So I started hounding him at his poker games, nights. He played poker every night. And in fact, the mess hall was set up for poker games at night. The mess sergeant supplied the beer and sandwiches, and the games went on there like a gambling casino, and they took a percentage of each pot. Made some money there. The non-commissioned officers did. Anyway, I took the opportunity of knowing where he was, that every night I'd interrupt his poker game and ask him for a transfer, and I said, transfer me overseas, transfer me to an outfit on maneuvers, but transfer me out of this outfit. Well, this went on. It got to be quite a plague. One day we were out marching around, and somebody came down and said, Private Saidels, report to the orderly room. So I went back to the orderly room, and they said, Private Saidels, report to the battalion medics. So I went to the battalion medics, and they gave me a complete physical, which I thought was strange. They gave me a bunch of shots. But, the Army, sometimes they lose records, and sometimes they repeat things. So I didn't think too much, except when I got done with the physical, they said, report to your supply sergeant. And I went to the supply sergeant, and he started handing me a steel helmet, gas mask, and a whole lot of rifle, a lot of equipment nobody else had. And I said, what's this for? Well, he said, looks like you're going with a heavy overcoat. Looks like you're probably going to maneuvers, or you're going overseas. Well, the only armored force we had overseas was there was some First Armored Division troops that had gone to Northern Ireland, or gone to Ireland. I'm not sure it was Northern Ireland. I presume it was. And the rest we had troops at maneuvers up in New York State, and we had troops in Fort Hood, Texas, I believe. But anyway, that was the story. And in the meantime, until my shipping orders came through, I remained at Knox, but I think everybody felt guilty because these were all older people and older soldiers, and here was this young 18-year-old who was going off to more active duty. So I did get permission to go to town on a pass, a verbal order commanding officer, and could spend weekends in Louisville until something materialized. In fact, I could stay in Louisville almost all the time as long as they kept calling in, because I didn't have any duty to do except wait for shipment. I was the only one leaving for shipment out of the unit. I took a chance and asked the first sergeant if I could go home. I hadn't been home since I was inducted, since I enlisted. And the first sergeant gave me permission, but he couldn't give me a written pass because there was a pending shipment. He said the only problem is to keep in touch, because if the shipment came through, I'd probably have only a couple of days, and I better be back because otherwise I'd be in trouble. So I did come back by train to Cincinnati, from Cincinnati to New York City, and then changed train at New York. And the train was full of people, soldiers standing, sitting in the aisles. The train was loaded. People didn't travel by air much then. And in fact, I recall meeting this very the trip necking from Cincinnati to New York City. Whereupon I had to leave and switch trains for South Station Boston, and I went to South Station Boston, and it was like I got in around 3 a.m., and my mother and father were there, and they picked me up, took me home, and had a big dinner waiting for me. That's about 5 a.m. And at 7 a.m., I was on the train leaving Manchester, heading back. So I got back, and shortly thereafter, shipping orders came through. Went by train to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. Camp Kilmer, we stayed until it was time to ship out. And being a replacement, not to any particular unit, I was with a bunch of replacements. There were about 60 people from odd units. And it was difficult. Couldn't phone home because the phones were all secured because of impending shipment. They didn't want word to leak out because the submarines were active off the coast. And and I had a friend, George Harris, who was a photography student in New York City at the time. There was a hole in the fence that I noticed around the camp that was only 400 or 500 yards, or maybe 200 yards up from the main gate. So timing, I slipped through the hole in the fence just as the bus was coming to the main gate, hopped the bus, because I had no pass to go into town. And the MPs could see me, but they couldn't get there fast enough. But they didn't worry particularly because they knew at the next bus stop and at the railroad stop, they always checked for passes, and they picked me up there. But when the bus crossed the state highway, I got off the bus and then picked up an interstate Greyhound going into Times Square. So I saw my friend, got back at night without any problem. Eventually, after several false starts of carrying our things to the train, going on the train down to the docks, walking down to the docks, and then turning around and coming back, because we eventually loaded up on what was formerly a cruise ship, and in the huge convoy we sailed, joined a huge convoy in the Atlantic in January. It was in January of 1943. The accommodations I had, we were the last ones to load, and probably 5,000 troops on there. There were thousands anyway, and they were mostly in cots, one above the other. They couldn't just pull their knees up without hitting the hammock of the person above them. But the last of us to load went into staterooms. And another fellow and I had this gorgeous mahogany stateroom with a separate private laboratory, beautifully paneled luxury suite. And we had it for about 3 days until an officer was going around checking the various staterooms to make a list of who was where on the boat. And when he knocked on the door, I came to the door in my underwear, and he said, "Sir," because he couldn't tell from looking at me with any bars on. And when I told him it was 2 privates in the room, we were shortly moved out and moved into the ship's hospital, because that was the only available space. And the hospital wasn't bad, at least it was clean. And it was in a fairly stable part of the boat. It was toward the middle of the boat. The seas were very, very rough, very high. I remember the tanker that was off to us, I guess it would be on our starboard side, which had airplanes on top of its deck, was just awash. The water would just come, waves would just go right across it. It was just this big, enormous seas, and boats as far as you could see in every direction. Anyway, I was sick most of the crossing. Very sick. And not to get into too many details, mainly my duty on the ship was, everybody had some sort of a duty, was they had huge wooden rafts on the upper decks. And there were 2 people assigned to each one, and if they yelled abandon ship, you pulled the lever and the raft would go off into the water. So 2 of us were assigned there, and I believe it was like from midnight to 4 a.m., which was pretty easy duty. We were both supposed to be awake, but one of us would sleep until somebody came around and wake the other one up. But when you came off duty, you could eat with the crew, and there was a small crew room, which was probably the size of a normal kitchen, of a big kitchen maybe. And that didn't have the smell of food and the food of sick people. The mess hall, which was in the back of the ship, was just a sea of spilled food and vomit. It's a terrible place, and steam. And it was impossible to go in there and not get sick. They couldn't eat. So, but here in the crew quarters, and rather in this little crew, it was a special off-watch room where they had marmalade, and they had some Spam, and they had some peanut butter, and things like that. So you could make a sandwich and some coffee, and that you could handle through the Straits of Gibraltar, and we went to Oran Harbor. We docked in Oran Harbor. The day of departure from the United States was the 14th of January, 1943. And I arrived in East Africa, Middle East Theater, 13 days later, the 27th of January, 1943. And eventually got out of the boat and went to a first replacement center, which was, I'm not too sure what the direction would be, but it would be, if you were facing Oran from the sea, it would be to your left. It would be to the left, up in high cliffs. Some sort of little summer resort at one time, I think. We had tents pitched up there. We planned on being there quite a while. First of all, they had said that no 18-year-olds would go overseas at that point, and then they had said that none of them would go into combat without prolonged training and so forth. So I figured I'd be there for a while. Well, that night we had some lonely German reconnaissance plane went over and dropped flares high up, and we all ran out into the boonies to get out of the way of the bombing that didn't come. And got lost wandering around out there, and eventually by near morning found my way back into the tent again. But during the day they called for Armed Force trainees, so we fell out, and Lieutenant Hurwitz, who was not much older than we were, gathered us together. They took about 80 of us, and he said, "Now we want to get you up as replacements to Tunisia, and what we'll do is we're also going to bring up these trucks. Let's see, there were actually more than that, because there were 20, 40, there were 60 trucks, so must have been 120 of us, because there were 2 to a truck. I see these trucks carry various loads. Some carry ammunition, some carry food, some carry tank tracks, and they have different weights, and some of them are faster and slower because of the weights." So he said, well, first off, how many drove trucks? How many knew how to drive a truck? Well, only about half knew how to drive a truck, so we split up and teamed. I didn't know how to drive a truck. I know a Jeep. I've driven a half-track. I've driven a tank. But I never drove a truck. So he said, the ones that know how will teach the ones that don't know on the way. Well, of course, we turned over 5 trucks, I guess, the first day with those heavy loads. And besides that, the lieutenant said, we'll go in sections of 20 per section because of the difference in speed of the loads. And if you find a section you're with is too slow for you, then you can move to the next section. If you find it's too fast, you can drop back to the section behind you. But the earlier we get into our day's destination, we had a different destination every day, soon everybody will be able to go to the nearest town, which we all wanted to see. It was pretty exotic, Africa. Well, it turned out to be something like a road race, and we just roar along, and the lieutenant would be standing in the next town with his campaign hat, the Spanish-American War type campaign hat that he was wearing, like a big Boy Scout hat, and he had a pistol on his hip, and he had a dagger strapped to his leg, and he'd stand there and he'd take his hat and he'd slap it on his leg and signal us to go roaring through the town, and we roared through the towns, And I think some Arabs get run over, if I recall, here and there because of these roaring trucks. But we got into our destination usually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd go to the local town where you'd see Vichy French pictures up, because the Vichy government was pretty much in control until we came in there. So there are pictures of Marshal Pétain there, and I met my first Arab salesman on the street who tried to sell me a knife that was made of practically tin, but he told me a little English he knew is good for killing Jews, he said. So anyhow, we made this long march across North Africa, and I recall very well winding down through these cliffs of Algeria along this road, along this tremendous canyon. In fact, I was leaning against the door, sleeping, and I hit the door handle, and the door flew open, and I reached out and grabbed the steering wheel of the fellow that was driving, was wrenching the wheel the other way, and I was pulling this way, and I can vaguely see now my mess kit and things disappearing over the cliff, going down. And luckily he was strong enough to control the wheel until I got back to more or less kept from falling out of the car. We ended up near Tebessa. Tebessa is in Tunisia. It's a city, walled city with an old Roman wall around it. City. Many times on the way they would stop by the road. There'd be these little Tuareg villages, up on the hills, mud villages. Anyway, there, we moved on just past Tebesser into a big field, and we kept our trucks, and they didn't need us for replacements as yet. It turned out to be a couple of weeks. So they kept us as an independent truck outfit for a short time. We had 3 officers assigned to us, and 2 black sergeants came over to teach us how to run a truck outfit, because in those days, blacks, who then didn't want to be called blacks, who were called Negroes, were not allowed in combat units. There were no black combat units at that time, and it was later in the war when they formed the first black combat unit. On the ground unit was the 92nd Infantry in Italy, and but these 2 fine non-commissioned officer sergeants, they were very nice. One was from Boston and one was from Chicago, and I can't recall their names. They took charge of the motor pool part of it, and we were just assigned to different we didn't belong to anybody, so we'd do runs for the British, we'd do runs for American units, we'd bring gas up to British tanks at night. By mistake, one of my friends fueled some German tanks one night. Another friend got caught by mistake, thought he'd get lost, fell in behind them, and followed them for quite some time, until I stopped for a break and he heard them speaking German. And we did this for a couple of weeks. I would have odd runs, and sometimes I'd take rations, and sometimes I would take fuel, and sometimes I'd take ammunition. And they're very, very tired. And but we had plenty to eat, because when we'd run ammunition food, we'd swing by the camp and we'd drop out special for us, so we always had an enormous amount of food, which our sergeant later on, who turned out to be a self-appointed mess sergeant, because our records, by the way, had not come with us. We were without records for about 8 months, and so we had to tell him what we were, and he had told them that he was a mess sergeant. He wasn't, but he told them that, and so he later sold all this food. He also sold the officers' clothes to the Arabs, and then split the money with them when they came back. They were away for a few days on detached duty. To back up a bit, the truck I carried when we went from, the truck I was driving when we went from Oran up to Tunisia was carrying tank tracks, and it swayed a lot. We traveled at very high speed, so the trip was made in only 6 days, which is quite fast for the distance. We received new trucks when we got up into Tunisia, but we were told that as we were not needed for replacements, we would for a short time be organized into the first provisional trucking company. It seemed that from there on in I was always the first something or other with the first provisional truck company then I joined the 1st Armored Division, 1st Armored Regiment, G Company, 3rd Battalion, which later was reorganized as we went from regimental to battalion organizations, became the 1st Tank Battalion, A Company. And during the winter, as well described later, in the mountains of Italy, I was in a temporary organization called the 1st Provisional Rifle Company of the 1st Tank Battalion, organized from some personnel of the 1st Tank Battalion as a rifle battalion when they needed some infantry during the winter. But anyway, during these various trips, we made trips when we were working as a provisional truck company. We made various trips up to the front. Of course, this driving is blackout. See, there are no lights at all. There's little tiny blue slits, but you can only see them from a few feet away. And sometimes we carried troops. Sometimes we carried all these other things that I mentioned. But most of them trips were in the vicinity of the Gafsa, Feriana, Sibitla sectors. And one night I just been pretty tired, and I went to a place called Clairefontaine, a little small town, and they had a radio unit there, as I remember. And in fact, there were 3 trucks of us that went there. I remember, and so I was the first. So I loaded up with all the gear. They were evacuating the unit. I didn't realize what was happening, but actually they were moving out. And so I loaded my truck, and then I pulled over and waited for the other 2 to be loaded. Well, I fell asleep while waiting. Normally that would happen, and somebody would come and wake you up, and then you'd move out. Well, if they tried to wake me up, I don't remember, but I woke up in the morning and everybody was gone. The place was evacuated, and a couple of Arab kids there climbing around. That's about it. It was a long ride back across the desert, which was fairly uneventful, except I remember seeing a British motorcyclist with a flat tire. I stopped, and I offered to help him. We put the cycle on the truck and carry it, but he said no, he could take care of it. He'd be off again. I just got back from this long trip, and I was pretty exhausted. And they told me to turn my truck around, gas up, put in some extra cans of gas on the truck, and pull into line. Before we pulled out, they checked our dog tags, checked our serial numbers, told us to carry a rifle and ammunition, and that we were heading for the front near GAFSA, but we didn't know what had been going on, that the front was collapsing. It had been very quiet for days up there. This was the 14th of February, and I've always been leery of Valentine's Day ever since. We took the road from Tebessa up through the two ranges of mountains that went and then down into the flat country, more or less around Feriana. There were about 30 trucks, and we were empty, and we had no idea what was taking place. And the Feriana, the leader of the convoy, which is Lieutenant Hurwitz, took a wrong turn towards Sabitla, so that confused things. And by the time we backtracked to the town again and took off down the road, that's the Talep to GAFSA road, we were about 2.5, 3 hours behind schedule. And this really was a problem. It proved to be a problem. At this time, the Feriana to GAFSA road, well, first let me say that the road's about 40 miles, that section, from Feriana to GAFSA. And we were totally confused. The officer in charge couldn't be located. He went off searching for something, and we just lost him. And the lead truck had only a very slight idea of what the score was. As I recall it, he knew we were supposed to go somewhere near GAFSA. As soon as we started toward GAFSA, I noticed many troops and vehicles moving to the rear, long columns. At first I thought it was a large troop movement, but before long I realized that this was a retreat. The roads became more and more clogged with vehicles, and more men and soldiers were American and French soldiers were loaded on trucks and half-tracks and jeeps, and we called them peeps then, by the way, not jeeps. And the peeps and SPs. SPs were a little bit bigger vehicle, and we called them SPs because they had a self-propelled gun. It was a 37mm pea shooter with a shield, which turned out to be useless. In fact, we took those things off and used them just for water carriers. But the soldiers were on the fenders and on the hoods everywhere, and they were completely exhausted, and of course it was clear that this was a classic scene of a retreat, and we were going to GAFSA in order to evacuate troops and civilians. After what seemed like an endless lifetime of driving along the clogged roads for about 20 miles, we stopped and talked it over. First, we were hours late, and second, we'd seen that the equivalent of what seemed like divisions had passed us by, and they were all gone now, and we had even left the odd stragglers and civilians behind. And the other trucks were coming up behind us. I was in the second truck, so the first truck and the second truck. We stopped there and we talked about it. And there were trucks going by us, with the retreat empty now. So there maybe one soldier in it or two soldiers. So obviously they were done evacuating, and we were the only vehicles moving toward GAFSA. What should we do? Should we go ahead? Should we turn back? We had no officer. The officer was still missing. So the decision we made was to proceed to GAFSA as fast as we could. And we drove on. This is at night, pitch black, no lights, on and off the road. I had my windshield open, because the windshield cranked up on those things. You could open it up so you could see better. I had that up, and I had the door open, and I was holding it open with my hand. I was holding the door open with my left hand. And my right hand was on the steering wheel. My left foot was out on the running board, my right foot on the gas pedal. We were doing about 60, 50, 60. And when I'd see faces coming at me from the side of the road, and I'd cut back to the other side. When I'd feel a ditch on the other side, I'd cut back to the left side until I saw faces. Then I'd cut back, trying to avoid people who were straggling down the sides of the road, and still to keep moving. We had a distance to go. On the way, as we were passing troops, there were French native troops, artillery unit, and I never saw him, but I hit a mule and the artillery wagon driver and the little two-wheel cart. The stuff came flying through my open windshield. Anyway, you didn't stop. You just kept on going because you had orders not to stop no matter what happened. First of all, there'd be a whole long collisions would result because of that. They couldn't see you behind. So, anyways, we neared Gafsa. You could see fires burning, and occasional explosions. And we crashed through a barricade. First, there was empty 55-gallon drums sitting in the road. We smashed through the first one. In the second barricade, about a mile from Gafsa, we were stopped. There was a military police lieutenant colonel who wanted to know where places we thought we were going, and didn't we know that the Germans were about a mile on the other side of town in force, and the Nazi tanks were trying to cut the road, and the ordered evacuation had been completed hours ago, and we better get the hell out before we were trapped, and that they were sitting there mining the road, and that German tanks were about 200 years out on each side of the field, and you could hear their engines running. You could hear the diesels cranking along. So we turned around on the spot, and he said, pick up anybody you see, pick them up and take them back 60 miles anyway, because otherwise they're going to be prisoners by morning, when the Germans snip off everything that's on the road. So we turned around on the spot and raced back along the twisting road. It was now a twisting road in that section. Twisting road that was difficult. You couldn't see because it was still black out, toward Talep. And I was driving at top speed, hunched over the wheel. Now we're the rear of the convoy, you see. I'm the next to last vehicle. And I'm trying to see as I'm driving, and driving more by intuition than knowledge. And also we were sweating out daylight because getting caught on that road in daylight would mean Stukas and ME-109s, and I didn't look forward to being strafed again. And especially on that open road in daylight. Just about dawn, in fact, as dawn was approaching, the sky was getting light, I'd say about 15 miles from Gafsa, I swung around a sharp curve, sideswiping a deserted French truck, and went into a ditch. What had happened was, I took my eyes off the road for a minute because I saw a patrol of troops walking along the side of the road. And when I looked back on the road, there was this enormous deserted truck. In fact, I can remember as I tried to get away from it and I clipped it, I can remember seeing a bicycle on the top of all these beds and everything else, the bicycle flying off of the truck. And I went into the road on the left side of the ditch, cut across the road and ended up in the right ditch. My steering was damaged. Gas tank, which was external on those trucks, was squashed, but it wasn't leaking. So anyway, I went over to I stopped the truck behind me, and I grabbed my rifle and hopped out and went over to the patrol and asked the sergeant in charge. I told the sergeant in charge to jump in the truck with his men because I had orders to take everybody out because this area was going to be captured by the morning. And he said he was on patrol and he had this duty to do, and he was going to continue his patrol as he was supposed to do. And I presume that he spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. So eventually he wouldn't go with us, so eventually I got back in the truck. In fact, I grabbed my things and went to the other truck, and he said, well, why don't you try it? Maybe it'll run. And it did run, amazingly. And I got back on the road, but it wobbled pretty badly, and I couldn't go very fast. So I went on for a short ways, and there was a load of French troops, Senegalese from Central Africa, tall, black, with tribal markings on their cheeks. You know, there were 3 scars on each cheek where they cut them and must rub in dirt or something to make these big raised scars. So we stopped the 2 trucks, and I loaded them up in my truck, you know. And it took quite a while because there were quite a few of them. They had a lot of baggage, and I couldn't take the baggage and them. There just wasn't enough room. So anyway, we did pull off, but when I did, my truck would only go to the right, and I went round and round and round in the field, the steering having gone completely. So I stopped the other truck and had my troops get on board that, and then with my rifle and my blanket, I got in with the driver. But first I went to I had a thermite grenade, which was incendiary, to blow up the truck. But at this moment, my long-lost Lieutenant Hurwitz showed up, and he said, don't do that, we'll recapture this ground in the morning, which of course never happened. We didn't recapture it for a long, long time.
So we pulled out in the other truck, and I was exhausted when after changing several trucks and getting a load of ammunition, we finally pulled into Tebessa at about 12:30 that night. Actually, on the way, I think it was, hold on. Anyway, I think it was on this retreat back when I was after I lost my truck and I was riding in other trucks at Talep. At Talep, we were bombed. There was an ammo dump, I believe, at Talep, and they were dive bombing us. So when they started bombing, I ran in the backyard of the Venero house and I lay down, on the ground. And I was very embarrassed when I looked up and saw the feet all around me. This Arab family, who didn't seem to know what to do in the bombing, was standing there looking at me. It was embarrassing. But anyway, near Feriana, at the airdrome at Feriana, Talep airdrome, we were strafed. And on the airdrome, I remember they had evacuated all the aircraft, but there were about 5 planes there, fighter planes, which were not flyable for some reason, and they were burning them along with a lot of ammunition to keep them from falling into German hands. So I hitched a ride in the truck, and then I ran out, so then I helped somebody, there was a little medical unit with a couple ambulances, and I helped them load up some stuff and rode with the ambulance driver. We picked up some straggling infantrymen, and one of them turned out to be the driver's brother, who he hadn't seen since he was overseas. And one way or another, we finally get into Tebessa at 12:30 noon on February 15th. This was a long day. It was a long 2 days. And I reported my truck lost, and the sergeant, I think his name was Morrison, he was kidding me about saying that I'd go on statement of charges for one Army truck and it would take me the rest of my life in the Army. I'd stay in the Army forever in order to pay back that truck. Well, of course, at $50 a month, less deductions, which I think I netted out $13, it certainly would take a long time to pay for a truck. Of course, that was just a joke. But anyway, I got another truck and left back for Feriana with about 14 other trucks. Before moving on that, back to that night on that GAFSA trip, just to give you an idea, we had 30 trucks and we lost 13 of them. I mean, total road accidents mostly. There were a couple of places where the road turned and where there used to be a bridge, and some of the guys didn't see it and went right off into the thing. So we lost some people killed and hurt. And then we killed several French soldiers and Arab civilians on that road. You have to realize that we were traveling at very fast speed, 60 miles an hour, blackout at night, no lights, none at all, along a road with hundreds of vehicles going in the other direction, stragglers on foot all over the place. That French soldier, with his little vehicle and the mule, they were right in the middle of the road. Evidently must have been crossing the road. At least 10 trucks behind me also must have gone over him. Anyway, for the next 5 days, we were very busy hauling stuff. I remember coming back through on night runs, getting off the road and being so tired not to stop and go and look at where the road was, but just driving through fields and through units and by until blundering back on the road hours later. Very, very tiresome, very hard situation. Finally, the Germans were held in a valley near Tebessa. By the way, at Tebessa we used to get dive bombed, but there wasn't much of anything. There'd be some light dive bombing in the mornings and the afternoons. And then they were stopped in the Kasserine Pass. We were very busy at this time evacuating troops and supplies and taking trips back up to Constantine in Algeria, bringing units back there because we thought Tebessa was going to fall. On the 16th, that's February 16th, 1943, I saw 8 fighter planes burned on the ground at the airdrome near Feriana. That's right. Anyway, I learned at that same time what had happened to some of the friends who had come overseas with me, because don't forget we came as replacements not belonging to any particular unit. And some of them, and I'm trying to remember this young boy's name because he had been trained as a clerk. In fact, he'd never fired a rifle. They were sent as replacements into the 168th Infantry, and almost all of them had been killed. In the next few days, we moved to the 9th Evacuation Hospital, and then we learned we were assigned as replacements. By now, we were needed to the 1st Armored Regiment. This was during the third week of February 1943. And I was assigned to Company G, 1st Armored Division, 1st Armored Regiment. We moved in there at night to this hillside as replacement. Well, first of all, what happened is our temporary unit was on the hillside. Some officer came up and set up a little folding table. It was only a couple of feet square, I guess. And you walk up to it and he'd say, well, what do? You know, what's your name, rank, and serial number? So he gave me name, rank, and serial number, and I said, well, I'm 604, machine gun light, light machine gun, 30 caliber air cool, So he said, okay, you're assigned to G Company, 3rd Battalion as a machine gunner. And they had no records for us. In fact, when we get paid many months later, we worked good because the franc had changed value about 3 times, and we get paid about triple. In our small pay, that was very useful. Didn't need any money then. We used to sell cigarettes and stuff to the Arabs to get whatever we wanted. Anyhow, we moved. When I was assigned to G Company, I went over to that area in the middle of the night with a fellow named Santos Spatola, who was not a particularly likable guy. I didn't know him that well, but somehow. In fact, I was confused. They mixed me up with him and called me by his name, and seeing I took offense. The name Santos stuck as a nickname. It was one of my nicknames for years. Another nickname was 92 because the 92nd Infantry in Italy, which was a black unit, I was very dark. I was so dark from the desert that I was as dark as they were. So that's another nickname. These were all good-natured nicknames. Anyhow, we went into that unit at night, and Santos and I pitched a tent on this hillside in the dark, and we curled up in there. And I remember when I woke up in the morning, which was like about 4 in the morning, 4:30. I had my blanket, and I was about 50 yards from the tent down the hill. I must have been sliding down all night, hauling my blanket behind me. So I went over and I found where the mess truck was. And I was standing there with my mess kit by the mess truck around 5 a.m. at 5:30 when the first sergeant came by. He said, what are you doing? I said, waiting for the kitchen to open. So he laughed and he said, okay, you're going to be on KP. And I laughed at having got KP the first day in the company. And actually, that really set me up pretty good with Sergeant Bassett, who was a wonderful sergeant, and was later killed on Anzio. Anyhow, in that night, we had all our equipment, and these fellows had lost their equipment because they had just been in the Battle of Faid Pass, and they had lost everything. And that's why we were replacements. They had lost about 90% of the company. They lost all the tanks. Anyhow, we had to put all our blankets. I had 3 blankets, all the blankets and all the stuff in a big pile, and then the other fellows came in, the regular guys, and they took what they needed and left me with 1 blanket. And I had a 1903 Springfield rifle, and I thought, boy, that was an awful ancient weapon, bolt action, single shot. So somebody said, you want to trade me? I'll give you my Thompson submachine gun. His girlfriend's name, I don't know what it was, but it was written in yellow paint on the side of the stock. So I traded them. Of course, it only took me a couple of days to realize that it was very seldom, except only at night, that you might get close enough to anybody shooting with a Thompson. So I had to wait a little while until we get some other replacements and get myself back on 1903 Springfield, which was an excellent weapon for the desert. And anyhow, that night I was on guard, and some light was coming out from under somebody's pup tent, and I said, soldier, get out here and cover up the edges of this tent because the light's shining out there, an airplane might see it. I gave him, cussed him out. This fellow came out and went around and covered up the tent with a little shovel, covered up the edges of it with dirt, keep the light from coming out. I later found out that was Captain Carl Key, a company commander. Anyway, here it was the 3rd week of February, 1943, and I was assigned to the command half-track with Corporal Jerome Lowry, T5, Sid Cohen, First Sergeant Bassett, Tech Sergeant Bequet, T5 Bequet, who was the driver, Privates Bergeron and Walker. I was assigned as the 30 caliber gunner. We also had a 50 caliber gunner. The command half-track served as, basically we also served as the infantry for this tank company because we didn't move with infantry in those days. We had to provide our own infantry at night. And we moved out through Talep and bivouacked in the vicinity of Kasserine, where we were bogged down in heavy rain for several days. It really poured, and we were absolutely stuck with interesting to give you an idea how desert rain. This place is bone-dry desert, but we were in like a bowl. It was low. Evidently, when the rains came, they came rushing down the mountains. I was sleeping in the half-track because I didn't want to put up a tent in the rain. I didn't want to lay on the ground in the rain. So I climbed into I left my tent and came into the half-track about 2 in the morning. And about 5 in the morning, Corporal Cordera came in, half-track. He said, "It's about a foot of water out there." We went out, the place was filling rapidly with water. By daybreak, the water was real deep, and we started to move out of there. Vehicle after vehicle was bogged down, and probably by 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, the jeeps were out of sight underwater. It was cold. This is February, you know. There was, of course, naturally little spots of ground that were a bit higher than other spots of ground, so I tried to take my sleeping bag, sleeping roll is what it was. We had this big roll, which was tied near the roof of the half-track, out of the water, and in my overcoat and overshoes and all my heavy equipment, walked to a little hillock, because I went over my head after going a few feet and had to swim. Bassett, being taller, was standing there, and he pulled me out. And he said, "That's what happens when you're short." And then he took a step and it went over his head. But anyway, got up on the hillock, went back, got some gasoline, put it in a little sea ration can. The rain's pouring down. Took my raincoat, put it over a bush, and tried to dry out my clothes piece by piece. I managed to burn the sleeve of my field jacket. Lost the lower half of lost it up to the elbow, which made me kind of a sad-looking soldier in later weeks. And in fact, toward the end of the campaign, when the German prisoner offered me some of his clothes because my terrible-looking field jacket, my knees were gone, and my pants, I had a hole in the rear of the pants about 3 inches square. It was pretty bedraggled. But anyway, though, here we were stuck in the mud, and we ran out of food. We had to haul these vehicles. As the water receded, we had to haul them out of the mud and try and get them to run. Steel cables hooked to the tanks, and 70 or 80 of us trying to pull a tank by hand. It was quite a thing. Eventually, we got a jeep so it would run, and Cordera and I went out looking for something to eat. We found an Arab, and we bought a couple of eggs, I think maybe 5 or 6 eggs. We ate a couple of them right there raw and brought the others back. Remember, there were these special hard candy bars on board. They were an emergency bar. It was like rock. You weren't supposed to touch them. It was just an emergency. Well, of course, I thought this was an emergency, but the officers hadn't decided yet. So whoever was on guard at night would steal a little piece of a candy bar. I mean, about an inch square was about all you could bite off after if you chawed on it quite a while. We finally did get out of there. On March 22nd, we moved up the road to Station Zanouche, and then Station Sened, and finally into bivouac between Sened Station and McNassie. McNassie was a mining town, and we were under pretty heavy air attack in this big wadi, just short of McNassie. The wadi was deep. We had tanks down in the wadi, and every morning, well, actually started in around the 21st. The enemy planes had come over, and they had, before we got into bivouac, actually, McNassie was on the 21st, that we've been strafed by enemy planes, ME-109s, and they strafed the rear of the column especially, and they shot up some of our half-tracks, the ones out of the maintenance company. And on the 22nd, I got off some rounds at them, you know. The first time we had a pedestal mount on the machine gun, you know, and so I'd fire from the pedestal mount from the machine gun on the half track, and dismounted. I had a regular ground mount, regular 30 caliber machine gun ground mount. On the 22nd, I got off about 150 rounds at 2 dive bombers that flew over us, but I didn't lead them sufficiently, and my traces passed to their rear. What I had done at this point, which really helped, the belts of 30 caliber ammunition was one tracer, one armor piercing, two ball ammunition, and I would change my belts so that I'd have just a tracer and an armor piercing, and then I'd have other belts that were just pure ball ammunition for night firing, so we didn't want the tracer for night firing. It gave away the position too good. And in the daytime, we could track the plane much better with more tracer, and also we hoped to scare them off a little bit because we didn't have an awful lot of firepower. Just a couple of machine guns that would fire at the planes. Usually, half the time, I'd be the only one in the company firing at them. Most of the people didn't. And anyway, we were bogged down in that 3-day bog by heavy rains and in that 3 foot of water. And we were out of rations for a couple of days. Spent the days pulling out tanks afterwards. I remember when we did finally get a little bit dried out there, there was we pitched a tent. I think it was Coleman and myself. We had dry blankets. Herman Muse was a very large fellow. Captain said, well, seeing Muse didn't have anything, his stuff was stuck somewhere, he could sleep with us. Well, he put a very large fellow in the middle with two small fellows on each side under regular-sized blankets, and we didn't have any blankets. And I remember we were all miserable. I remember walking by Lowry and Cohen's tent at night. I was on guard. It was about 8 o'clock, and I heard Cohen say to Lowry, "Lowry, what time is it? Is it morning yet? Is it near morning?" And I hear a little light, a match strike, and then he said, "It's 8 o'clock." And a few minutes later, I'd be walking by again, maybe 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, and Lowry would say, and Cohen would say to Lowry, "It must be morning now," his teeth chattering. It's February, soaking wet, you know. Cold in the desert at night in February. And teeth are chattering, and he says, "It must be morning now." It was actually only 10 minutes. And again, they'd strike a match. No, Lowry said, "It's not morning yet. This is being pretty miserable." And all day long pulling on cables with the wreckers, trying to get the tanks out. Anyway, during this period they dive bombed Sinet, but they never bombed us, and we would have been stuck terribly if we had, you know. We were in a very bad position, stuck like that. Certainly they could have wiped out the 3rd Battalion if they knew how badly we were stuck. You know. We were out of food, we were out of water, the vehicles, the tanks were at crazy angles. The roads were a mess. Anyway, hold on a second. On the 25th we moved up, this is 25th of March, I believe. I mean, don't get mixed up here now. I got a notation here. Let's see. Yeah, it's March 25th. We moved up into position near McNassie to attack a mine town. McNassie was a mine town in the mountains. And we were in this big wadi. The Germans were checking the range with their artillery, and the enemy there was the 10th Panzer Division, and some artillery units, 75s, 88s. They had big 210 millimeter artillery also. They also had some Italian infantry, German reconnaissance, and some miscellaneous German machine gun units that were attached. And we were under continuous shelling and dive bombing. Usually, if I remember, in the morning around 10:30, so they'd dive bomb us, and then in the afternoon it'd be a high altitude bombers, twin engine bombers, and then during the night they dropped flares and bomb. Actually, they didn't hit an awful lot with the bombing, except they did get one hit. We had one special half track with twin 20s, I think they were, for anti-aircraft defense, and one bomb right initially fell right on, wiped the thing out right away. And the shells, these large, enormous shells, would come screaming in, and there were a lot of duds in those shells. We understood later that they were made in Czech ammunition plants, and the Czechs must have sabotaged some of those duds. But the Germans got very smart, and they mixed the duds with delayed action shells. So that made them very effective, because sometimes what we thought was a dud would turn out 15 minutes later to blow up. Unfortunately, we had some artillery in the same wadi, and that drew counter-battery fire and bombers like molasses. To get the layout, we were in a wadi. There was a large wadi in front of us, maybe, let's see, I'd say about 1,100 yards. That sounds like quite a bit. Anyway, maybe 350, 500 yards in front of us there was another large wadi. And on the other side of that was the German positions. And at night they'd move up to the large wadi, and at night we would move up to the large wadi. And then before daybreak we'd move back to the edge of our wadi and set up machine gun outposts on the edge, which was my job. And at night we'd go forward machine gun outposts to outpost the large wadi. That was to protect us from infantry attacks, because tanks couldn't track across the wadi. It was too big, too deep. And during the morning, during daytime, we kept only one post on duty and two off duty, so they could sleep, you know. So we were dug in, as I say, on the edge of the wadi with a conventional mount. And on the second day there, we caught a very bad dive bombing, 12 Stukas. And you could see them, they come in low bank, you could see them in their t-shirts. Sometimes they'd wave. They'd climb up and they'd make their dive diving, they run. On one of them, I was running. I had been asleep at my machine gun post, and it was about noon, and I was awakened by the pounding of the machine gun fire. And I looked up, and there the 12 Stukas peeling off right overhead. So I started to run down into the wadi, at the bottom of which I had a slit trench, to get into the slit trench. I was about halfway down when the first bomb hit about 25 yards away. I flattened out, but not before my helmet had several pieces of shrapnel hit it. They just grazed it, but they cut nice grooves in it, nice shiny grooves, and I just was very fortunate. The bombs almost all hit right in the wadi, and the earth just kept heaving up one after another. They bombed it. And that afternoon, about 2:30, 12 Ju-88s came over. That's the twin-engine jobs, whose engines were interesting, because at night those engines they were not synchronized on the Ju-88s. They go vroom, 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 vroom. And this time I got off anyway. At 2:30, I got off about a lot of 30 caliber fire, because I mounted my machine gun high. I dug a ditch around it and mounted it high for any aircraft fire. And Bassett was on the 50, and we really got quite a bit off. I got off about 250 rounds, and I could see they were going in. However, I didn't see any direct results. I understand that later one of the planes crashed into a hillside, but I have nothing positive on that. I could see that he wasn't gaining altitude after making his attack. Night was tough. Night guard in this area was pulled by the machine gun. I pulled machine gun night guard almost every night, and listening post and others. Listening post, you'd go forward, find a little depression in the ground, and just lie there with two people, one awake and the other asleep. And when one would turn, was be awake for 2 hours, and then you'd shake the other one. And you were between the outposts and the enemy. One night anyway, I was on duty on the edge of the forward gully with Coleman. He was my loader on the 30 caliber. At about 4 a.m. we heard some heavy tanks, enemy tanks rather, moving up just on the other side of the wadi. There was also a motorcycle, some personnel. So I woke up Lowry, who was with us, called over Lieutenants DeBarry and Lieutenant Ritter, who were in charge. They came up there a while, but they seemed quite muddled and scared. Lowry and myself were really more in command than they were, and we decided, Lowry was a corporal and I was a private. So we decided to wake up the company commander. So I went back to his tank, coming across to the main, from that wadi back to the other wadi, climbed down the wadi, woke him up and told him what was going on. He told me to return, and he'd have the other tanks awakened, and the tank's engines started up so they'd be able to move first thing in the morning. Not being able to find my way between the two wadis in the dark, I just couldn't find my way across. I kept trying, but I get lost. I went up a connecting wadi, which meant going left and then up a connecting wadi to the main wadi. During the daytime, we didn't go near that connecting wadi because it was under observation. Except once in a while I tried to go up there at night, because there was a slimy green 2-inch pool of water there, which we were short on water in this period. You know, we didn't have water to shave or anything. I got some of that green slimy water once and boiled it and ate it, drank it, did something with it. So I got to our post by coming up in front of it, which was a dangerous thing. Very steep, you know. It must have been about 50 feet deep, you know, that wadi. Lowry was still on a machine gun, and the lieutenants were still lying to his rear, protected by a slope, and seemingly scared. On my way up, climbing up in front of our machine gun, a machine gun cut loose from the German side of the wadi, and it raked the wadi, but it didn't hit anybody. Lieutenants, against Lowry and my wishes, moved us back with our machine guns to the other wadi. This seemed to me foolish, as it left us open for attack. At dawn, our guns shelled the German tanks, and they got one hit. The others got away. During the nights of McNasty, every few hours they dropped a few shells in our area. Mainly it kept us awake. It wasn't very effective in hitting anybody. And mostly they were 210 millimeters, which is a very big shell. You'd hear this enormous whistle and explosion. They'd be quiet for about 5 minutes, and you'd go to sleep. And about every 2 hours, about 5 minutes later, you'd be back to sleep. And about every 2 hours, they'd wake us up with this same routine. We had more artillery than they did in the area, but they were very good with theirs. They used a lot of airbursts, which were very active. Anyway, I get kind of sick. This is describing again the area around McNasty in March of 1943. Getting shelled and bombed and strafed, and not being able to shoot back didn't suit me, and didn't suit Lowry. So after a bit, Lowry and I decided that it would be very worthwhile for us to make a patrol into the territory directly opposite us, held by the enemy, that's directly to our front, which we had sort of studied a little bit through by looking through some bushes. And so we asked the company commander, who was Captain Carl Key, who in turn asked Major Cole. Colonel Cole said he'd let us know. We didn't hear from him for a few days. But one evening, it was about 5:30, we were told to report to the battalion command post ready to go. I carried a Thompson submachine gun, 5 British-type hand grenades, which is sort of a Bakelite grenade, and mixed. I had some British Bakelite grenades, which were concussion grenades, and I also had some regular American fragmentation grenades. And I also carried a pistol in my pocket. It was a .45, and it was a big army overcoat that I was wearing. Lowry carried his .03 Springfield and some grenades, including a thermite grenade in case we ran out of a tank to try and burn the tank up. We went to the battalion command post, which was a ways away, and we really had never seen it in the daylight, where Colonel Cole told us that we were to go to a different sector. This is not what we expected to do. We expected to make a raid across directly from us. So he told us to go to a different sector, which was down on our right, about a mile from where we were. And there we'd contact some combat engineers who were holding a railroad bridge, which had previously been blown up. Combat engineers was the 16th, probably was the 16th Armored Engineers, I imagine, which was our unit, division engineers. In line along our wadi was our G company, then there was H company, and then there was headquarters company, and then there was this engineering detachment about a mile down. The railroad ran across this blown up bridge, which used to span the wadi, up to the mining town of McNassie. So we went to the right, anyway, to where the engineers were holding around the bridge, and we were given a note to the commanding officer of the engineer unit. Combat engineers should get combat infantry badges, because mostly they were doing in Africa, they were mostly acting as infantry. And the note was to allow Corporal Lowry and Private Saidels to pass through their lines.
I want to interrupt here because there's a mistake I keep making in here. I keep saying the town of McNassie was a mining town. McNassie was in a flat, but there was a mining town up in there near McNassie. That's more accurate.
Anyway, we got there, but it was dark, of course. We didn't know anything about the terrain, and they showed us their machine gun outposts, and they made the arrangements. And about 7:30, we crossed the wadi directly under the main bridge. They were very skeptical about our going out there. We asked about minefields, and they said, well, they thought they were mines, thought they were British mines, German mines, maybe some American mines, but they didn't know where they were. Well, that was very encouraging. They also didn't know anything about the terrain in front. Nobody had ever patrolled it. Well, getting down to the bottom of the wadi where there was water was difficult. We finally ended up sliding down the bank, and all kinds of rocks and dirt was splashing in the water, which we felt would certainly alert all the Germans across the way. And we didn't know how deep the water was, and this is winter, so cold at night. So we figured we'd better take off our shoes and wade across to save our shoes so they'd be dry on the other side. Well, it turned out there was only a couple of inches of water there. So we went across the other side, and we stayed a little bit away from the bridge as we crossed. So instead of going directly up the other bank, we moved up the wadi about 30 yards from the bridge. We went left away from the bridge. And then we moved in about 300 yards. It was very, very black, and I have no night vision at all. Thank God Lowry's night vision is good, but I couldn't see him. I mean, he was only feet away from me. I would just have to listen to him and then move in his direction. We moved about 300 yards when we heard voices and other noises. And we flattened out and lay there for about an hour. Things quieted down. And we went forward for about another 800-900 yards. When we heard a German outpost setting up, you could hear them setting up the machine gun, cocking it. Sounded like about 8 of them. And we lay there and listened and appraised the situation. about 2.5, 3/4 hours. They sent flankers out on both sides, and they had contact patrols. To our front, they were about 25 yards in front of us. We almost walked on them. If they'd been a little quieter, if they'd been set up, we probably would have walked right onto them. Probably there was about 6 in the crew to our front. And to the left, about 125, there was another one. And then to the right, about 125 yards, was another one, probably like listening posts that we set up. And then they had walking patrols about every hour, probably of 2 men. We lay there for about 3 hours, and decided if we attacked the post to our front, we'd be caught by the post to the right and left. The ground was flat, there was no cover. We lay there with our guns cocked, with a grenade spread in front of us, ready to go. I had on my British Bakelite grenades, it had a screw top. You unscrew the top, and it had like a sewing tape with a weight on the end of it. And I unwound it a little bit. My Thompson I had propped with dirt, safety off. Accidentally, I leaned over to ask Lowry to whisper to check the time, because they had moved to, some of the personnel had moved. I believe the flankers had come in or gone out or exchanged personnel or whatever. And my helmet clinked on his helmet. And a few seconds later, a flare went up directly overhead. I had to pull my head down because they'd see the reflection off my glasses. Not a very comfortable position. But luckily they didn't see us, because we'd been in a very desperate condition if they had. We decided to return with the information, which we had been ordered not to make a raid. We'd been ordered to find out information. So we get up and walk quietly for about 50 yards and then move more rapidly. We had to move. Lowry led the way, and I covered him with my Thompson. And I was afraid of losing him because I couldn't see him. But the moon also was starting to come up behind. We could see the sky was getting light behind the mountains, and the moon would be coming up, and we didn't want to get trapped out there. Once the moon was up, we'd never get back. We reached the bank and eventually sweated out crossing the water, worrying about being made perfect targets by either side, hoping our own machine gun post knew, because we had told them we'd be back earlier than that, and we hadn't. We couldn't make contact with them, and we finally stumbled on their secondary position where they were sleeping, So we told them to get on their toes. And about an hour and a half later, we reported back to the major, who sent us to Combat Command A with our information. We turned it over to G2, and they proceeded to shell that area. We then turned in. I don't think I was ever exhausted, and it was wonderful getting back to the front. That type of patrol activity, every minute or every hour, seems like 10 hours of a normal life. Getting back to the frontline positions, it was like lifting a 200-pound weight, is the way I memoed it. It was a very odd feeling not to have to watch yourself every single second. Anyway, this was our stay in that particular wadi. And we stayed there about 8 days, and then moved back about 3 miles to a large field. Made 2 unsuccessful attacks from there on the mining town, but we didn't lose any personnel, that is, G Company didn't. While we were back there, interestingly enough, though, in this area about 3 miles back, we set up a little camp there, and we were standing in mess line, and all of a sudden, rifle grenades started exploding all over the place. Well, there was a little hill along one side of us, and evidently somebody else was set up on the other side and didn't know we were there, and they were using the little hilltop for practicing rifle grenades. They were overshooting and landing in our area. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. Then we occupied another wadi in a different part of the McNasty sector for a while. This is more typical of what it was like. On the roads, we carried panels on the back, colored panels on the back of our tanks, so that our own planes wouldn't shoot us up. We didn't have many planes. Actually, the most air activity we had was a Division Piper Cub. And it was very good because it went up in the air. The guns would tend to shut down because it was an artillery spotter, But P-38s finally turned up, odd-looking plane. First P-38s I saw, and I think they were the last I saw, strafed us. They killed somebody in the tank behind us, and I think they wounded somebody in the tank in front of me. And my crew bailed out, and I fired on them. Because it was just planes coming as far as I was concerned. Until they flashed overhead, I didn't see the stars. When I saw the stars about the same time I saw my traces going into them. We didn't hit them, but they unfortunately did some damage to us. At high speed, they probably just, or maybe they mistook where we were at. Maybe they had their directions wrong. But this happens. Later in Italy, we lost Division Headquarters radio section because of B-29s dropped their bombs in the wrong place. And that's how I happened to go to radio school, but that's another story later. We made a feint, an attack which caused the enemy, it was a night attack, to withdraw and move to another section of the Tunisian front. We went to Sidi Bouzid, then to Sabila, familiar territory. Some of our tanks went towards German-held Faid by mistake, and we had a lot of trouble straightening out again. Then we made a move up toward Pichon and Karawan, and we learned that the 8th Army had bypassed us, and we withdrew to Faid. While at Faid, we saw what happened to G Company. Remember, I came in as a replacement in G Company 2 months before, and we saw what had happened to G Company on February 14th while I was having my problems around Gafser on the 14th, on Valentine's Day. It was now April 14th there. We bivouacked on the other side of the road from Jebel Lasouda. Jebel Lasouda was the mountain at which G Company had its unfortunate experience. And I walked over one day with some of the fellows, and as soon as we passed the first tank, we knew what the story was. The fellows that were killed were still inside it. And we looked over to see the remains of our friends and company comrades. The first I saw was sitting in the driver's seat. He was about the size of a dog, burned to a blast crypt and melted down into a lump. They were all the same. Each tank had from 1 to 3 inside, except for one fellow, Dick Richards, who had evidently dismounted from his tank and come out fighting, and he'd been shot near his tank, and he'd been buried by the Germans. It was a very simple grave about 6 inches deep with dirt piled over, and his helmet was on the marker, and his scarf was sticking out still from under the dirt. Those who weren't in the tanks we assumed had been captured, and we accounted for 15 tanks. 2 had evidently escaped because there's 5 tanks in each platoon, and there's 3 platoons, and then there's the executive and the company commander's tanks, with 17 in all. The place still smelled badly of burnt flesh and decayed flesh. It was a very strong smell still. And it was very hard to determine that to visualize that these crispy pieces of flesh were once soldiers. It was hard to believe they'd ever been alive. We identified tanks by name, which was still visible on most of them. Later we found that what we thought was dead was not always true, because sometimes a driver might have got out, for instance, and a co-driver may not have been able to get out his hatch and went over, and got killed in his seat. So sometimes it was misleading. We also could check where the enemy gun positions were at the time of the attack, and some of the 88s were only 200 yards from the tanks, and they couldn't miss. They had towed the 88s up and then gone around the mountain, placed them in place, then the tanks that towed them there had gone around the mountain and hit them from the rear. So much for... By the way, while we were in this area, which was now a very secure rear area, General Patton came up with his flying squad of protection and immaculate, and of course naturally was gigging everybody for not wearing a helmet or for not having their leggings on or things like that. He was very much despised. I think one of my friends said that the saddest thing that happened in the war was Patton crossed in front of his gun sight and he forgot to fire. Anyway, from here we withdrew to Morsat, M-O-R-S-A-T, which was about 20 miles on the other side of Tebessa, where we rested for several weeks. In fact, we could, by now the front had bypassed us so far that we could build fires at Morsat, and it was a very interesting thing. It was to be able to build a fire, a simple thing, but you really welcome a fire. We stood around the fire at night and we all talked about it, and I said, boy, if I ever get a house, or if I ever get a home, or if I ever get back to the States, one of the things we're going to have is a fireplace and a fire, because it was beautiful. And we had a formation on the side of a hill, and we called a roll call as sort of a memorial to everybody that had been killed up to this point, captured, was wounded so badly they weren't there. And it was very interesting. We stood there, and the roll was called to the company, and including the ones that were no longer there. I can remember Lieutenant Tucker standing there with his German boots, the big black boots that he'd taken off a German, and his rifle, which was unauthorized. He was a good soldier. Tucker was later killed in at Bari when we went from Africa to Italy. He went on a ship to port of Bari, which we didn't go to, but somehow he was on that ship, and it was an ammo ship, and they got hit, I believe, an by a torpedo plane and blew up. He was a good soldier, unorthodox soldier. And once one of his tanks his tank was so far ahead that one of our other company tanks thought it was the enemy and hit him in the rear. Anyway, after about a 2-week rest at Morsat, we made a forced march to a place called Beja, which is in the north. And we went from Morsad up to Sucaras, and from Sucaras to Souk di Arba, I guess it would be, and then up to Beja. We were about somewhere between 2 and 4 miles from Beja. Beja had a typhus epidemic, by the way. We bivouacked there in a big field. It was a big wheat field, until we could get brand new tanks. It was more modern tanks. By the way, we had Shermans. Originally there were Grants, but then we got Shermans. And the Shermans had 75s, and later we got better guns. We got better tanks, newer tanks with better guns. I think they were 90s. First there were 76s, and then I believe 90s. So after drawing the tanks, we moved up through the mountains to several miles south of Matur. But while we were at Beja, and I had a lot of sketches that I did at Beja, people sitting around shaving and cleaning guns and things. These were all done in the field at Beja. It rained a little bit there, and I remember I had a shelter half, which is half of a pup tent. I remember I didn't have much in spare bedding or anything at that point. I remember laying my raincoat down and my clothes down and my blanket on top of that, digging a ditch around it all for the rain to run off, and then stretching the shelter half over it and pegging it down so the rain would run off. And that shelter half, that overlapped the little ditch, and the water would run in the ditch and then would run out at the foot of the thing. And then I got in there with my rifle and everything, and that was the way we slept. It was, in the distance there was a big hill of poppies. The whole hillside was poppies. It was blazing red. It was very pretty. So anyway, we moved to the mountains several miles south of Matur, where we stayed for a few days while 155s behind us threw shell after shell over the mountains at the enemy. And then one night, rainy and dark, we moved up through Matur and bivouacked on the other side of town in a large field at about 12:30 a.m. On this move in the rain, Sergeant Malukowicz was sitting on the edge of the tank so that he could direct his driver better. And he slid off, and unfortunately, the tank ran over him. We pulled into the field at Matur during the night, and I pulled the first relief of vehicle guard. You see, you have company guards, and then you have a guard on each vehicle when you're in an area like that. Every single vehicle has one person on guard all the time. And I pulled the first relief on the vehicle guard, which was 2 hours. That was until about 2:30, and then I slept till about 5:30. And I started to dig a slit trench while I was on guard during the night in the rain. But I couldn't find the hole. The ground was so hard that I'd push with a shovel, and then I tried to find with my fingers where did I start to dig, and it was like digging in the cement. It was impossible to get anywhere, so I stopped after a couple of tries. In the morning, we had sea rations as usual, made a little coffee, and started to dig in. I got down about 10 inches when the first shell came whistling in and exploded about 150 yards away. This field that we were in was all tanks except our half-track. The whole field of tanks.